So when talking about Julian's case, I find that people who are have never been exposed to WikiLeaks or have just a very passing reference to Julian, maybe they've heard reports about him, but really don't know the story. They're really passionate and interested once they hear the story and they hear the stakes and they understand what it's about. But in general, I find that not only is it that Julian's not in the news enough, but there's a whole context that's difficult to overcome quickly. Because for me, I started university in 2002. I marched, in the Iraq War marches of the time. I experienced all that shift with the war on terror, the dismantling of the international system, basically, over time. And I see a progression. But for people, say, under the age of 30, they don't have these reference points. I don't know. Do you find that?
Yes, I do. And it's kind of difficult as you get older to put yourself in the place of younger people. And the truth is, of course, that the Chelsea Manning revelations, for which Julian is being charged and for which he's being extradited, refer to events that happened, between 2002 and 2006, 2007. And most of the people now at university weren't, well, they were born, but they were toddlers. If you go into a university now, the majority of people who are students at university were not yet born when 9/11 happened. And that means there's a huge amount of context and background that they simply don't have, or they've learned as history, for which they have no feel. And for our generations, the Iraq War was a massive traumatic event. A war which everybody knew to be based on lies. The public understood that all the way through, but it was an aggressive war based on lies. Millions and millions of people marched against it, and we couldn't stop it. That opened so many eyes as to the reality of politics in the world and the place of the people as opposed to those holding power, and our inability to hold them to account, which are lessons which, in a sense, are now being learnt again with what's happening in Palestine. We in many ways have a repeat of the Iraq War situation. But Julian's role in that, and in exposing the lies and exposing the horrors of war, the crimes of war, that is now history as opposed to current affairs. And partly, of course, this is a factor of just how terribly long Julian's effectively been incarcerated. This has been dragging on now for over a decade of incarceration. And it's just going to get worse in that sense, that the events for which he is incarcerated will get more and more remote. So in a sense, the campaign has a constant struggle to keep things current. But it does involve a terrific amount of explanation. It's also, of course, it's not just a problem that young adults didn't live through the events which are the cause of the injustice. We also, I think, need to remind ourselves that the majority of people don't pay enormous attention to these matters. Most people are preoccupied with the struggles of their own lives, bluntly, and increasingly the struggles of people's own lives have got more and more desperate in the UK. This has been a period in which the poor have got steadily poorer. More and more children have slipped into poverty. Work security has become a thing of the past for an entire generation. And so the amount of attention people have really paid to the issue is not always that great. And we have to continually remind ourselves of that. And of the need to explain the issues at a fundamental level. I think that's very important.
I think that's true. But the way I see Julian's case, well, initially he exposed the criminality and the corruption of Western powers, but the reaction and persecution of Julian and the backlash against WikiLeaks has itself become an exposure. So even though the reference point for many about what WikiLeaks published and how this came about is less important than him as a symbol of Western brutality, abuse, hypocrisy, decline. And so I think I see it as a two-part thing where sometimes it's an uphill battle to explain all the context. Actually, people keep coming back to Julian's incarceration as a reference point. I don't see people forgetting about Julian, but rather his relevance as a persecuted Western dissident becoming more and more relevant over time. And this, of course, again, is the effect of the passage of time. Every day that he is incarcerated, again, without conviction now, 1,703 days, I think, is further evidence of the abuse, right? So there's kind of a two-part exposure. First he exposed them, and then they exposed themselves.
I think that's true, and that the flagrant abuse of the persecution of Julian as an individual makes him an extremely powerful symbol of freedom. In the same way Nelson Mandela was a symbol of freedom throughout his imprisonment. And I think there's a genuine parallel to be drawn there. And of course, the blatant hypocrisy of the West when something happens like the imprisonment of Evan Gershkovich by Russia, which quite rightly is strongly protested by the West. But the Russians, of course, can turn around and say, well, you're holding Julian Assange for exactly the same thing. Once you set a precedent of accusing journalists of espionage for publishing things you don't want them to publish, then of course that precedent is going to be taken up and used by other countries around the world, and you've lost your moral standing to complain. So I think Julian as a symbol of liberty is important. And I'd also like to extend that in a way, because the internet has changed radically. There's much less freedom on the internet than there was 20 or 10 years ago. The internet has become dominated by corporate gatekeepers, where nearly all traffic is channeled through either Facebook or Twitter or TikTok or Instagram, or these corporate identities that have managed to essentially seize and channel huge amounts of internet traffic, particularly anything to do with social interaction and exchange of ideas between citizens. And that the internet wasn't like that. It was much freer and much more open years ago. And I think this is one area, and this is in many ways the area of Julian's expertise. This is what he's brilliant at, which is the use of the internet and his explosive use of the internet with WikiLeaks to disseminate true information to the people in the face of governments who didn't want that information disseminated. That was absolutely fantastic. And I think he would be an enormous influence now in trying to find ways to free the internet from these corporate gatekeepers. We always used to say, rather complacently, that the internet would always find a way around. We used to believe that somehow internet freedom would always get round any blockage, but it's not really able to get around corporate gatekeepers. Even on my own website, 90% of the traffic comes from Facebook or Twitter. These are issues which need to be tackled. It's not that we need Julian to be freed because of what he's done in the past. We need Julian to be freed because of the contribution he can make in the future.
Yes.
That's a direction I'm anxious to move the campaign in, if you like. Of course, it's great that people want to free him because of the great things he has done, because of sympathy, frankly, sympathy not just for him, but for yourself and the children. Those are all true. But I also want him to be free because I believe he still has great work in front of him. And I think we shouldn't forget that.
I think I do emphasize that when I'm doing talks and so on. And it's very interesting that people come across Julian's writings from literally 10 years ago. For example, Cypherpunk's Freedom and the Future of the Internet, I think that's from 2012, before Edward Snowden blew the whistle. And it lays out basically what Edward Snowden then went on to expose in detail, but the general trend of what was going on. So there's a lot of people rediscovering things that Julian said, for example, around war. There's a very famous video from a rally, protest where Julian was speaking at in 2011 about the Afghan war, where he lays out the goal in Afghanistan is not a successful war, it's an endless war. And the idea that actually the war industry profits and that there's a transfer of wealth from the tax base of Western countries to the arms industry, basically. And that, of course, the major Western countries are major arms exporters and involved in the arms industry. And all this kind of big picture analysis that I think has seeped into the politically engaged internet generation. And these things resonate. So it's a big picture, deep understanding that people share and have taken a life of their own. So I see Julian's influence as growing actually over time, even though these videos and these books are 10, 12 years old.
I think that's true. And it is, if we're looking for reasons to hope, and we need to look for reasons to hope because so much of what's happening in the world is awful. But I've, when I give talks and in my writings, I've always emphasized, this question, which of course has been known about ever since Eisenhower and the military-industrial complex, and you go before that to Lenin, to J.A. Hobson and other theorists who've analysed it. But when I talk about the use of overseas policy, the use of war to channel profits to the arms industry, and the fact that the arms industry, of course, has politicians and civil servants in their pocket because it pays them loads of money to the politicians, and it gives the civil servants jobs when they retire. There's a revolving door to go between the civil service and the arms industry, and that it's a vast corrupt system. Despite having a long history in theoretical thought, it certainly wasn't accepted. It was viewed as a rather outrageous thing to say by polite society. And it wasn't something which you could easily say to even to a lecture hall full of international relations students without arousing cognitive dissonance. You could see them looking at you thinking, my God, there's some sort of lunatic Marxist here, and starting to switch off. I don't get that anymore.
Yeah.
I find those kind of things are much more understood by the younger generation in particular. They do tend to think they've discovered it by themselves, but I do find there is a broader understanding of society in some ways among young people, and that is a result of the internet. That definitely is. That is a result of various forms of horizontal sharing of knowledge, interacting via social media in different ways. And so there are reasons to be hopeful, and there's so much more to be done.
I'm really interested in your perspective as a kind of insider-outsider, because you spent how many years working inside the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, top diplomat. And I'm really interested in the psychology of the institution. How much groupthink is there? How much groupthink did you absorb while you were there? What made you become a whistleblower? How much internal dissent is there?
This is a, a very large question, which we may have to break down a bit. But I was in the office for 22 years, and 6 years of those I was in what's called the senior management structure of the Foreign Office. But I should say I left 20 years ago now, and so I think many things have changed since I left, though much still continues. But what I'm going to say really relates to my own experience of the Foreign Office, which is now slightly out of date, and I think that we have to bear that in mind, though it hasn't changed in any fundamental way. Yeah, the Foreign Office recruited when I joined, and again, this really hasn't changed much, I think, from quite a narrow social strata. Mm-hmm. It has, and this also hasn't changed, it has a sort of fast entry stream, a normal entry stream, if you like, and a clerical entry stream. Okay. When I joined the office, the fast stream and the normal stream, called the executive stream, the fast stream was called the administrative stream. Those were both graduate entry streams, whereas the clerical entry stream was a non-graduate entry. It's now all graduate entry. For anything, you would now need to be a graduate. The fast stream was very small, which is where I got in. In my intake year, on my induction course, we were 22 people. Of those 22 people, only 2 of us hadn't been to Oxbridge. 20 out of 22 were in Oxbridge. Overwhelmingly Oxford, not Cambridge, I would say, but Oxbridge, 20 out of 22. And I was the only one who didn't go to private school. And as somebody who was both private school and Dundee University, that made me, an extremely strange creature in the Foreign Office. And people were very kind, and I mean, nobody ever showed open prejudice towards me because I came from a different class background or anything along those lines. But it was different. You just came from a different place. I remember in my first week, someone said to me, "Yes, he's at Dundee. Yes, what's a high table like at Dundee?" And I had no idea what he was talking about. So we don't have high tables. Our tables are sort of normal height in Dundee. It was, so that was strange. I recall this lovely lady who was head of recruitment when I joined. She called me up about 2 weeks before I started, saying she's phoning everyone up just to see if they wanted to come down for a chat. And I thought, this is your future employer. You're about to be employed by these people, so it's kind of compulsory. I thought, it's not really voluntary in those circumstances. And I flew down to see her from my parents' home where I was living at the time, which was in Inverness. And I wandered in to see her, and she did just want. She said, "Well, how are you thinking? How are you feeling?" And that was kind of it. And I said to her, "Is that it?" She said, "Yeah, I just wondered if you wanted to." I said to her, "You do realise I've just flown from Inverness?" I said, "You do understand Inverness is the same distance from London as Vienna. You do understand that?" And of course, she didn't understand that Inverness is the same distance from London. She probably never met anyone from Inverness. And probably met a lot more people from Vienna than she had from Inverness. So it was a bit strange. I felt an outsider in that way, but it in no way was exemplified by prejudice or unkindness. And in those days, the Foreign Office was very intellectually open. I mean, it prided itself on being extremely intellectual, on having only the very cleverest people in the country there. And you could write a document or paper that dissented as wildly as you wanted, and you wouldn't get in trouble for it. I remember the time I used that most, I would guess, prior to my becoming a whistleblower, was just before the first Iraq war, when I was working in a unit with the Navy. And I was actually based literally in an underground bomb shelter that used to be Bomber Command. It was an underground NATO headquarters, and I was sleeping there 7 days a week. And on a daily basis, we were reporting to Margaret Thatcher. In fact, I was seeing her personally most days of the week before breakfast. I used to go in an underground tunnel into Downing Street. And Margaret Thatcher sent us, and we knew the war was about to start. The build-up of troops was happening and stuff. Margaret Thatcher sent to us a message, which went to the Navy in general, I think, and to our unit, saying, basically, we're about to go to war, don't worry, God is with us. It's Christmas, let's have a war, basically, was what the message said. It was just very shortly before her resignation. And I replied to her with quoting the carol, It came upon a midnight clear, where I said to him, on the other hand, there is this, my minute said. And I put, I can't remember the whole verse, but part of it is, beneath the angel strain have rolled 2,000 years of wrong, and man at war with man hears not the love song that they bring. Oh, hush the noise, ye men of strife, and hear the angels sing. And I applied to her sort of Christian Christmas message with a peace Christian message. And even people who worked, particularly the people from the Navy I was working with, were so, my gosh, you can't send that to the Prime Minister. You're going to get sacked. We'll all get in trouble. I got in no trouble about it at all. And in fact, she told me she thought it was charming. But so it was open in that way. It really was in those days. My first desk was the South Africa desk. And at that time, we didn't talk to the ANC, who we viewed as a terrorist organisation. In fact, the official line was, this was 1984, the official line was, Nelson Mandela is a terrorist and should be in prison. That was the British government line. And I wrote a paper on why this was wrong and why it was doing us no good. And because it was a paper designed to win the support of the government, who were conservatives, what my paper basically said was, look, apartheid's going to end. It's unsustainable. It is going to end. At the moment, the black people in South Africa hate us because we are supporting apartheid, and they know we're supporting apartheid. Unless we start to change our policy now, we're going to be in a very poor position, and British businesses will lose out once apartheid ends. And that was the way I phrased it. And again, this was completely contrary to policy and completely contrary to Thatcher's known opinions, and largely contrary to Geoffrey Howe, who was Foreign Minister, to his known opinions. And I wrote that and sent it up the chain. It went all the way to them. And as it went up and up to more senior people, they all commented on how wrong I was, and how apartheid certainly wasn't unsustainable, could go on for a long while, and how South Africa, was a model for the rest of Africa that showed basically if you put white people in charge, Africa could be economically successful. All kinds of nonsense people were writing. And part of the reason for that is that as you got to senior and senior officials, by the time you get to quite senior officials, the way to promotion is to be promoted by ministers. Ministers really decide. Right. I was made an ambassador eventually by Robin Cook. Because he happened to agree with me on such things. And the civil service at senior levels is intensely political. And people who are more interested in their careers than anything else, of course, are going to write what ministers want to hear, because that's how you get promoted. But I did get in trouble about it. And people rather liked me. They thought it was quite nice to have this kind of eccentric left-winger walking around. That's like sort of pet. Here's Craig, he's frightfully left-wing, and he didn't go to public school. They all thought it was hilarious.
You're like the red team.
I was like the red team, yeah. It was quite strange. But I always felt an outsider. I mean, I never felt quite part of a club, and the place was like a club. It was like a gentleman's club. I mean, I haven't spoken of a sort of male-female balance, which was very heavily male in the upper ranks. There were more senior women, but they were kind of token more senior women, if you like. It really was. It was frightfully, and it was all leather settees and mahogany desks and little old ladies bringing cups of tea round and stuff. When I first joined, we had people like coal fires, which disappeared shortly after I joined. But it was very clubbable, and it was very nice to be inside. You were in a position of extreme privilege, and you sort of knew it. Then when you were overseas, of course, you were a diplomat, and you didn't pay any tax, and you had everything duty-free, and you had servants and drivers, and I mean, even before I was an ambassador, when I was Deputy High Commissioner in Ghana, I had, I think, 5 indoor servants. I had 2 gardeners. I had 2 drivers. The lifestyle.
Yeah.
And partly for that reason, and again, I think this is less true now, but it was very true at the time. An extraordinary number of my friends in the Foreign Office were aristocrats. Were from the aristocracy. I knew several members of basically the Asquith Bonham Carter family. Mm-hmm. There were several of those wandering around. One of my first bosses was a chap called David Gore Booth, who would be the son, I think, of Churchill's cabinet secretary. And of course, one of his aunts was the famous Countess Markievicz, I think, the Irish Republican Marxist aristocrat. But and there was, I knew the McLaren of McLaren, Lord McLaren, who was who was a diplomat. There were lots of members of the aristocracy. How they managed to get in when entry is meant to be by competitive examination is a great mystery that I genuinely don't know the answer of. You have this extremely difficult process. You had a first written exam that lasts hours and hours and hours and is very hard. Then if you pass that, you have a second written exam. Then if you passed that, you had 2 days of exams and interviews in London. So how you go through that kind of process, I managed to come out with a bunch of aristocrats at the end of it, when it's a little difficult to believe that the aristocrats are just naturally the best people at written examinations. And you have 60,000 people entering, and you're taking 22. I've never quite understood how it works, how the bias in recruitment crept in. But it plainly was there, and I don't think that's changed that much. But it was one of the very few places where if you were from an aristocratic background, you could maintain an aristocratic demeanour, and you could have servants and drivers and gardeners and everything provided for you without paying for it, which is what being an aristocrat is. It's one of the very few places you could still do it,
right?
All on the taxpayer. So it was a wonderful club to be in that sense, and it was quite difficult to leave. That made the act of whistleblowing, knowing you were giving all that up. While I was ambassador in Uzbekistan, I had one chap who, as far as I could tell, his only job was that he sat on the porch and he waited until I came home from work, and then he picked up my briefcase and carried it inside for me. And in the morning, when I was leaving, he would pick up my briefcase from the breakfast table and carry it out to the car. And he didn't seem to do anything else, as far as I could tell. It was that kind of... And when I went to bed at night, I would just, as I went up to the bedroom, I would just take off my clothes and leave them lying on the floor, literally. And before I woke up, they had been washed and dried and pressed and were back in the cupboards. It was just... Yeah. It was an extraordinary lifestyle. And giving it up, is difficult. It sucks you in. There's no doubt about that.
And did you realize that you were putting it all in jeopardy by blowing the whistle?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, definitely. When I learned that people were being tortured and that MI6 and the CIA were receiving the intelligence from the torture, and I should say that was compounded by the fact that I knew for certain, just because I was there on the ground and investigating things, that much of the so-called intelligence from the torture sessions was lies. You know, it wasn't true. It exaggerated the strength of Al-Qaeda in Central Asia enormously, because that's what the CIA and MI6 wanted to hear.
Right.
And I thought, well, I've got to stop this. And so I sent a first... when I first complained to London, I did so in the naive belief that London didn't know it was happening. You know, but I will tell them this. They don't realise people are being tortured in Uzbekistan. They don't realise that the intelligence resulting from it is untrue.
Yeah, it's bad intelligence.
It's bad intelligence. But the thing is, for them, it was good intelligence because it's what they wanted to hear.
Right. It was serving a different goal.
It was serving a different goal. It was what they wanted for their propaganda purposes in the war on terror. They wanted to hear that Al-Qaeda is massive and strong and all over Central Asia. And in fact, it wasn't. It was more or less non-existent in Uzbekistan. And there were long lists of people from the torture sessions named as being in Al-Qaeda who I knew for certain weren't in Al-Qaeda, including, for example, one guy who I knew for certain was a Jehovah's Witness, which made him sort of unlikely member of Al-Qaeda. But I thought London, exactly that though, I thought London doesn't want bad intelligence. And I thought that we are going to, they don't realise that it's coming from torture. But of course they did in fact know both those things, and they didn't care. So I was terribly naive. When I sent the first, and you must remember, I knew people, like Peter Hain, for example, was a Foreign Office Minister at that time. I'd known Peter Hain from the Young Liberals and the anti-apartheid movement when I was 15, 16 years old. We'd played football together, and I thought, Peter Hain's not going to support torture. Some of the Foreign Office ministers, this is the Labour Party. I thought Tony Lloyd and other decent people. I thought, well, they're not going to support torture. And of course, I was terribly wrong. They'd all been convinced by Blair, convinced by the war on terror, that this was a war of good against evil, and the gloves were off, as Tony Blair said. And that torturing people was a necessary evil. When I first sent a report reporting it was happening back to London, I did think it would work. I thought, well, they'll see, when I tell them this is happening, they will stop it. I was incredibly naive. That didn't happen, and it became plain that London were angry with me. And I received a letter telling me I was over-focused on human rights. That's a quote. I was over-focused on human rights to the detriment of British interests. That's exactly what the letter said.
Wow.
And then when more evidence of the torture on a mass scale was coming to me, and I thought, I've got to try and stop this. I knew I was going to be in trouble. Even before I blew the whistle, I knew even protesting any further internally at that stage was going to damage my career, because the Tony Blair, Jack Straw operation in the war on terror was unquestionable, and they were absolutely intolerant of any opposition. And at that stage, I had a conversation with my then wife, Fiona. I had a conversation with her, and I said to her, look, I can't live with this. I can't. I just can't have it on my conscience. I can't go along with it. But it does mean, I think I'll probably lose my job over this, and we'll lose this lifestyle. And another factor of the lifestyle is that our children were at very expensive boarding schools, which was all in the UK, extremely expensive schools, which was all paid for by the taxpayer. So we would also lose that. And I didn't have any other income or prospects particularly. So it was quite a tricky thing. But I had that conversation with them. So look, if I persist in this, I am going to lose my job. But I had no doubt at all. I didn't have a second or millisecond where I thought, well, it's okay, I can go along with this. It never occurred to me that I had a choice in that way. And to be fair to my former wife, she was entirely supportive and completely agreed. No, I knew that was the end of my career. That either I had to shut up and go along with torture. And at that stage, it was later I discovered the extraordinary rendition part. At that stage, I only thought it was Uzbeks who were being tortured. It was only a little later I discovered that the CIA were actually flying people there in order for them to be tortured. And that, of course, became even more of an issue. And eventually I blew the whistle. And I should say, when I blew the whistle, I didn't expect only to be sacked. You know, I expected to go to jail. I expected to be tried under the Official Secrets Act. That was what I thought would naturally be a consequence. But it is interesting because, and I've wondered about it. Well, I mean, it changed my whole life, and in a material sense, it changed my whole life for the worse in terms of, you know, finance and circumstances of living and things. In fact, it led to me being a much happier person, which is rather nice. But I've never understood, and I still don't understand, why it was that I had no doubt whatsoever that was the right thing to do, and that my material circumstances really were nowhere in this, when other people didn't see it that way. Because there were hundreds, literally, of other senior officials or other officials in the Foreign Office who knew what was going on, and nobody else resigned. And that's not quite true. One Khan Ross resigned. And Elizabeth Hill Wilmshurst resigned over the legality of the war. So 2 or 3 people resigned, but almost nobody resigned.
So you became a whistleblower and lost your very privileged lifestyle. But would you say you're happier? Oh.
Don't hang up. You are hearing this because the prison estate have introduced a message to warn you that prison calls are recorded. If you hang up before the end of...
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, Julian. I'm just speaking to Craig. I will. Yeah, good. A very interesting conversation about his time in the Foreign Office and the culture around it, and Thatcher. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Okay. Yeah. Bye. All right. So, but you're much happier now.
Yeah, I think things, you know, worked out for me strangely in a way that gives me happiness. I have the important things in life that give me happiness. I have a pretty clean conscience. You know, there's not a great deal where I feel I have to reproach myself. I've tried to do good in the world, and I've achieved, you know, real happiness in my personal life. I'm very fortunate with Nadira and 2 more wonderful children. So I now have four children who are all very close to me, and my old family, my new family get on extremely well, which you know, I'm blessed in that, because that's not always the case. So no, I mean, nobody has to feel sorry for me. I'm a happy person.
Nadira is wonderful.
Yeah, she is. Nadira's great.